Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar podcast. I'm Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
I'm Beth.
KD.
KP.
I'm Hayley.
Kenneth.
And before we get started, I just want to remind all of our listeners that you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. And we are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. Our topic for today is one presented by Jordan. The topic is Rousseau versus the Rogue, the social contract in gaming. And just to get everyone up to speed a little bit, the social contract, as defined by dictionary.com, is an implicit agreement among the members of a society to cooperate for social benefits, for example, by sacrificing some individual freedom for protection or for state protection. Theories of a social contract became a means of explaining the origin of government and the obligations of its subjects. So, Jordan, this was something that you wanted to talk about. So, what do you want to talk about?
So, when people form a role-playing group, what they're essentially doing is creating a little micro-society. And the world that they decide to inhabit in their minds is essentially brand new and can be anything that anyone that the group consents to. And so that's an interesting moment politically speaking, I guess, because it's the closest that we can get to that stateless, pre-society kind of condition that Rousseau and others have talked about. And there's interesting dynamics, I think, that come out of how a given group with no real pre-existing rules as to how they're to interact with each other, outside of game mechanics, obviously, but social rules. It's a complete blank slate for them, but there are preconditions to that working, and obviously everyone's there to have fun, and so there's always friction between what one or two or half the players or whatever would consider fun and what the rest do. I don't know, I just thought it would be an interesting thing to kick around. It's that question of, the individual liberty versus, the good of the society. In this case, society's, half a dozen people or whatever. I brought up the rogue in that title because the rogue is typically the shit starter in a D&D group. They're out for themselves and everyone else is a team player, stereotypically speaking. So, I don't know. I was just wondering what you guys thought about this weird little consensual, spontaneous society that we form every week.
I assumed you picked Rogue for the alliteration.
That also helped. Yeah.
The way I see it, there's really two different dynamics, like one main dynamic, and then it kind of feeds into a second dynamic in the social contract. And that one is the metagame social contract of everybody getting around the table, deciding what characters you're going to play, deciding if those characters, well, sometimes deciding ahead of time whether or not there's going to be any friction between those characters. And then there's also the aspect of, in character, whether or not the characters themselves are going to get along, and one definitely feeds into the other. At the very beginning of the campaign, the metagame feeds into the endgame, but as the campaign progresses, the endgame begins doing a feedback into the metagame, especially whenever between different characters, you were saying the rogue is usually the shit stirrer, and it's the quintessential example would be the rogue wanting to steal or do something illegal and the paladin saying no.
Yeah, I'm kind of going with that. I was kind of stewing on this. Something I find interesting, too, when you start out a group, like this goes with the metagame aspect you were discussing, like, and kind of dipping into what you said, like when you first when you're trying to make that base of, government in the literal sense, but in this sense, like our gaming world, is when, like, what people bring into their first D&D group, for instance. Like, you bring a lot of stuff from your own friend group, your own social interactions, your own social circles, and you put a lot of those in a game. Like, for instance, let's say you guys had, you used to play Yahtzee or something. You had, like, a fudge rule, like, let's re-roll that, whatever. And that's, not how you play Yahtzee, but that's a thing you put in. And you're like, okay, D&D, let's just sometimes have a fudge roll. Like, we messed up, whatever, let's do that again. Like, some people can change it based on social interactions they've had beforehand, and even integrate other people's, like, social circles into theirs. Like, a few of my D&D games I've run, like, I've liked what other people did in their games and adopted that idea and put it into mine. So it's cool to see how it becomes, like, almost like a body of like synthesization. That's a weird word. Let me try that again.
Slow down there,
Yeah.
Maurice.
Slow down. It's just
It's never raving.
You're not getting paid for words per minute. You're not.
well, aggregate's a better word. Just different, like aspects into the game and making it your own world versus like, the first time you start off. It changes a lot as you go, and it's cool.
Speaking of changing a lot as we go, the stewardship, perhaps, of this podcast has changed slightly throughout the episodes. Kenneth, briefly, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sorry, I guess I've been talking. Hello, I'm Kenneth. Nice to meet you guys. I'm a friend of the group here. Was invited to hang out. A little about myself. I love games. I DM. I've been in games. Played video games. I've seen a game up close. Yeah, I went here to Athens. I graduated 2 years ago, and right now just living in Dayton, Ohio. So having fun. Glad to be here.
You've now given out all your personal.
Oh yeah, no. I threw it out there to see if people visit me. That'd be awesome.
I'm doxing you as we speak.
It's perfect.
But you bring up a good point. The social contract created by your gaming group can change over time, and there could certainly be things in that social contract that is specific to your group. The idea of a fudge roll probably just prickles a lot of your ninnies out there, listeners. That's cheating.
I don't do it, I promise.
But I'm sure some groups could get away with that. Certainly not this one.
Of course not.
I think it's really interesting to bring up that social contract shift and change. I think no matter what the contract is, whether it's metagame or in-game, you should always have some sort of steady base where you can say, I could add amendments to it. The social contract will change depending on if a character dies, or if a player has to leave. What does that do to a group dynamic, having more people or less people? So no matter what the social contract is, I think it's important that you as players and you as characters are able to come together to edit that contract, no matter what the new clause would be.
I partially agree with you. One thing that I'm going to rip right from Rousseau is the notion that because we're only able to have this game, we're only able to have this collective fantasy because of the social contract. The social contract is more important than any individual who adheres to that contract. And so, although I agree that naturally dynamics will change if a player leaves, you shouldn't have one player dictating your collective contract anyway.
Oh, no, not saying that, the needs of the many definitely outweigh the needs of the few, or the one. But if it comes...
I like Star Wars.
I hate you.
I watched KP die a little bit when he said that.
It's not a matter of one person changing the social contract. It's kind of that, I think it's a specific case when a person leaves a group, but if you notice things changing in your group, or several people continuously break those rules, there's got to be a reason that rule isn't working, that so many people are breaking it. So you should be able to come together and have a discussion about it.
But is it the rule being broken, or is it just a different interpretation as to what everybody has implicitly agreed upon in the group? For example, going back to the example of the rogue doing something that the paladin hates. It's what the rogue is built for. There is, in that instance, there is an out-of-game, usually an implied out-of-game agreement that, yeah, that's going to happen. This is going to be an interaction that we do out of character, that our characters are going to get into this argument. But I've seen it happen many times where third, fourth, fifth time that this argument comes up, it gets a little bit more heated, and there's not really a division between in and out of character going on, because it gets to the point where the rogue is entirely following the social contract, or the rogue and the player are totally following the social contract as they understand it. I am playing this role. We all agreed I was going to play this role, and now you're getting pissed off that I'm playing this role?
Right, so who's infringing on the contract?
Right.
Is it the rogue or is it the paladin? If you just get down to settling it as, well, the paladin is a big brute with his plate mail and his broadsword and, puts the rogue in his place, well, then your society has devolved into that Hobbesian state of nature, where it's just red in tooth and claw and might makes right. That's not exactly the ideal outcome, I don't think.
I was just going to say that the word implicit, I think, is really important there, because most people, I don't think, are ever even going to discuss the social contract. I sort of knew what the social contract was going into researching this, but not really. I had to read a good bit about it. And it's not, like I said, it's not something people are going to explicitly discuss a lot of the time. And a lot of clashes, like Clayton was talking about, come, I think, from that, the conflict between characters come from people's implicit contracts clashing. Everybody understands it a different way. I think one of the important things to keep in mind is that if you have a conflict, we're always coming back to the idea of communication, to communicate with your DM or with the other players to try to figure out where those different ideas are coming from before you just assume, well, this other player's an asshole or this GM's an asshole. Like, they might just be coming from a different area. Like, it occurred to me when I was talking about this earlier that that's why pugs or pickup groups in the More Pigs and different games like that suck so much, is because, I mean, aside from the fact you probably do have a few people that are trolling, but I think a lot of the reason why they always suck is because you have a bunch of people coming together who've never played before. They all have completely different implicit contracts in their heads, and that creates a lot of conflict.
So if the idea of a social contract, when it relates to humanity and societies, gives us the freedom to have morality, I suppose, it gives us the freedom to be civilized in whatever sense that is. It gives us the freedom, I think most importantly, to, as I understand it, have rational thought and deny a lot of our animalistic urges, which is a freedom we could not afford if the social contract did not exist. How does that relate to, or how does it transfer over to gaming? As I said, we could not play these games if the social contract didn't exist. So what freedoms are we granted by agreeing to this collective fantasy, by agreeing to play? Does it give us the freedom to be creative? Does it give us the freedom to have our own approaches, which, as we've just said, causes conflicts? What freedoms does it afford?
I guess it would be the freedom to have a contract that is not normally our own. In real life, we all have different social contracts, and then giving yourself over to this fantasy, to this new world, it has all different rules, new contracts. It's assigning yourself to different rules that could not be possible in the reality that we live in.
So, in a D&D game, I have the freedom to shit all over my friend's lap.
That's a high roll, though. It's like, you get it, though.
In a D&D game, I have the freedom to do whatever the hell I want and tell all of my friends that they're pieces of garbage who deserve to go throw themselves into a wood chipper.
I mean, your character, your game. I mean, I'd hate you.
No, I don't think so.
I disagree with myself.
I think that
here.
you have to, like, remember that you're in a group and, like, you should be looking, like, to maximize everybody's fun, not just your own. I think the kind of player that that just goes for maximizing their own fun and doesn't think about anybody else is always violating the social contract.
Yeah. I think the D&D the RPG social contract might be more similar to our regular Western, because we're all Western anyway, societal social contract than we realize.
Touching on what you said too, which is interesting, is you have to think about the split too between, like, let's think of, like, a Morpiga versus, like, just a Morpig. Sorry, I was saying because I made fun of it, but Morpig versus like a D&D game, because when you get into, like, let's say World of Warcraft, you go in there taking in, like, Blizzard's, like, they've already set kind of a social contract and a literal contract for you, saying you're paying per month, that fancy stuff, but they have rules set in the world, and game rules are meant to be, I don't want to say more tangible in the respect of you have these limitations. Now in your groups and you're hanging out with people, it's a whole different thing. But when you make your class, what you can do, what you can fight, the raids you go on, the groups you go with, very much is dictated in games. That has more of a structure to it that you then devolve once you hang out with the people there. Like how you guys go about a raid, how you take your roles, how you speak to one another. Like things like that, it has layers to it. While D&D, what you're talking about, it does have that more open aspect where it does have solid rules, but because it's us, let's say, sitting in a room playing together and we're not in somebody else's prefabbed world in the respect of it's literally in front of us, we're looking at things, and wow, you can change those rules, and your social contract can directly change the skeleton of the game before you get into it. So that's one cool thing about D&D is you can make it more malleable, while if you go into, like, a large MMORPG that's already assessed for you, you just have to adapt inside of it. You know, anything this
Your statements are all, like, very dense, nougaty chocolate bars, but there's good stuff in there.
Yeah, so there's a lot there.
No. One thing I just latched onto is this idea that because we're sitting at a table looking at each other, things are different than if we were sitting at a laptop in a dark room in a pickup game with people from all over the world.
Exactly. Like you said, we all have different contracts too. So, I mean, when we meet new people, it's different. Well, in this, we already know each other. We already have a social contract together outside of the game, like the whole metagaming thing. And then inside, now that we're here together, it's a different dynamic.
I'm not so sure that it's accurate to say that the social contract in a game grants any rights at all. I think it's in fact the opposite. That it is the price that you pay, the rights that you give up as a precondition of having the collective experience. If you didn't want to do that, You could sit by yourself and have whatever imagination trip you want, become a total schizophrenic if you feel like it. It's only in the giving up on your own limitless imagination to some degree that you have a collective experience with other people. That's different than the real world social contract, where that in fact does grant you rights like freedom from brutal violence and various things like that. But when you're talking about imagination, you're the only entity there. So it's a little bit different.
Maybe I didn't phrase it quite well enough. As I understand my limited and years ago reading of Rousseau, there was this concept that not necessarily a right that you've earned, which I do agree that playing an RPG with a social contract doesn't necessarily earn you any rights, but at least not in the same way that the regular social contract we all walk around in every day does. Anyway, this idea that the regular everyday we walk around it social contract allows you to be free from having to only rely on your instincts. You don't have to just have fight or flight all the time. You are more free to think rationally and to go and study philosophy or whatever you want to do. That's what I'm wondering, if there's anything we can think of for the RPG social contract. Choosing to do this, I guess in that same way, are you free from an unlimited fantasy schizophrenia kind of personal voyage in your own skull? Are you more free to like own and temper that and create beautiful things?
I think you're onto something interesting, that you really just have chaos if you don't have some kind of restrictions on whatever it is that you're doing. There's a reason why Infinite has that IN at the beginning that is otherwise a negative thing, that it's not a good thing to have just limitlessness, because there's nothing there, it's shapeless, and that's the way the Greeks thought of it. It was a lack of form. I think that you're right, that particular restrictions, it puts meaning into it. Otherwise it's like playing a game on God mode. It's like, what are you doing? You're just wasting your time. You haven't accomplished anything. So yeah, I think you're onto something there.
Some of that could come from the rules as well. It makes me think of, we have a fan of Apocalyptia who plays games now and again on his own. He is both player and DM, and I think Apocalyptia is it's an interesting way to play test a system, I'll say that. But that I could see how that could be fun. In the same way that sitting down and playing a single-player video game is fun. But in that sense, you are still adhering to a set of limits which are established in the rulebook. It's not just this kind of childhood, I'm going to sit down and have a fantasy, like have a daydream. Because in that sense, you are just a god. And then it would get really boring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, even the case of, like, being the DM or the game master, like, you still have, like you were saying before, you need a set of rules or at least something, so then you yourself aren't just, you are literally the master of the world in your own way. But you have to make sure it's obviously fair to the players, and you set that up where you need to, like, have a system where you're just not that overbearing deity, because there's multiple types of DMs, one being that guy who's like, oh, I'm gonna punish you guys, and you're here to not have fun, and you're like, why are we doing this? And then there's the DMs who are almost too nice, like, I'll give you
and
too
that DM
much.
has broken the contract that's been established.
Absolutely. And then, like, there's also, on the flip side, you can break the contract by the DM giving too much, because then your players almost have that infinite, I can do anything, and then they just do whatever they want, whimsical in the world, and you just kind of lose that form of what you're trying to do in the first place. I've seen that happen in both games. Either breaking apart because of too much, or too constricted, so you have to find, like, at least DM standing, like, this is kind of a weird subtopic there, but you have to find, like, a good middle for that, for you and your players to keep that contract, still have fun, but have the option to have, like, okay, this is a RPG, we can be what we want to be. In our contract, we want to have fun with the limit.
I think that there's a sort of interesting thing you can look at when it looks at certain groups and their contract theories of seeing whether or not they're particularly Hobbian or Lockean in their makeup. You know, that being Hobbes' theory of, oh, well, we're all just animals that need to be, like, have these rules put on us to keep us civilized, and Locke being much more about freedom of expression, and that, you know, we're not animals, we descend to something higher, and we all have the right to, like, a pursuit of happiness. And I think that really goes to, like, the group makeup and how your social contract theory is defined by, again, do you need to play a little bit rougher with the players as the GM, or do the players need to play a little bit more rougher with the GM?
I think a lot of the social contract comes from who's at the table defining the term. I think that's really important to assess the group that you're playing with. when talking about social contracts. So it can only just be like sitting down in character creation or like for a session be like, okay guys, let's figure some shit out. Specifically in character creation. I mean, going back to if you're doing a paladin and a rogue thing, figuring out how those two are going to interact, because they're going to obviously have different wants and goals and morals, but finding a way to make everybody at the end of the day work together, because you need a party if you're going to play a game. That's plain and simple. It's social contract rule number 1. You can't have a game without everybody.
What Kenneth was saying about, like, talking about particularly the social contract between the players and the GM is one of the most interesting things to me. One of the most important things, I think, is the concept of player agency. That, like, the decisions that people make and the skills that they've chosen for their characters should make a real difference in the game. It shouldn't just be that, what this is going to happen regardless of what you do. And also, I think that one thing that makes a good GM is if they have decided that as long as the players come up with a good plan, as long as they've got good decision making behind it, that plan is going to work regardless of whether the GM thought of it before or not. They're not just going to be like, well, I've come up with this one way that you're going to solve this, and this is how it's going to work.
That ties into what Kenny was saying, and it's something we've touched on this podcast before, this idea that mass media seems to think RPGs are always that megalomaniac DM throwing anything and everything just because they feel like it and they're allowed to do that, and the players deserve this punishment and it's not fun. Like, think of how many, Community comes to mind again, but like think of how many different shows you've seen where it's not a show about gamers or nerds or whatever you want to call it, but they do a D&D episode. Wow, wacky! It's always some character becoming this megalomaniac as the DM, and then you've got other stereotypes that are just really not true and haven't been true for a very long time once people figured out how to play these games and how to realize that, yes, the best thing to do as a DM is to let your players facilitate your players' fantasy. That's what the DM needs to do, no matter what. It's not about any one person, DM included.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Like, I was going to say, the way I kind of, like, after playing enough RPGs, watching things, and, like, learning throughout my life, like, the best way to have a game, obviously it's hard to balance, but the best version you can have is, like, you are building a world for your players to enjoy themselves in, so I give you a narrative, but you're the one that's going to help me write it, because it's your story, not mine. I'm going to give you the backdrop, but you'll be the ones who act upon the world. And judging by, again, the social contract or whatever agreement they make before we go in, let's say they're like, you know what, because I kind of have in one of my current games, like an eviler party, so they're like, we're just going to be kind of weenies. So, hey, if they want to make a dystopian future where they're the lords of this realm, that is them. I've given them the narrative to write with it. And it's their choice of, actually fighting the main villain, joining them. Like, I definitely like the idea where it's more of, you can give them the standard, this is your villain, this is your quest, do what you want, and then let them choose how they go about it. Like I said, befriend them, pull in another army, become lords themselves, fight this. Like, I give them multiple options, or I like seeing that. So then again, they feel like they've truly acted upon this world, and I'm not having the world act upon them. So it's more of a player choice. And I think you brought that up, which is interesting, a lot of like the weird D&D episodes, and one of the cooler versions of that was, if you ever saw the Dexter's Lab one, where it starts out, where Dexter's like the megalomaniac, like he's controlling and his friends are having fun, he kills them all, and he's like, haha, because he takes it as a competition where he has to win as the DM, and then Dee Dee, his sister comes in and just makes a really fun game, and like, she's just playing it like, let's just play D&D, and the players love it because they can just make their own characters, have fun, and the DM isn't actively trying to kill them, and then Dexter learns, oh, you can have fun by not being a dick. I was like, that's what it comes down to sometimes. That's one of the few episodes that was actually good with D&D.
That's great.
How much relative power in the social contract should one individual have? Let's say that there is a game going on and one character just does not fit for some reason. Like, if there's a character who is playing a total pacifist and they don't participate in any of the game as far as combat, but it's a combat heavy game, and that player is just not having fun. It's obvious to everyone. How much power does that one player have to kind of change the dynamic of the group, of what the game master of the game that the game master is presenting, so that they can continue to have that player or that character that they really love? Do they have to change the character?
I'm gonna be an asshole. If you're not having fun and you're playing a pacifist in a combat route, it's okay. You don't have to fight everything. I don't play a lot of fighty characters. I find other ways that I can engage and have fun and still add things to the party. So if you're not going to stab the villain, try to get him to monologue. If you can't think, throw other people weapons or something, or just find a way to engage yourself. And if that's not working, yeah, sit down at the table, talk to everybody, say, hey, I'm not having fun, this isn't working. But I feel like there's a part of yourself that if you're not having fun, at least try a few different things that are still you're comfortable with and you think a character would be comfortable with. But there's not one way to fight a battle. There's never one way to fight a battle. Talk, do other things.
I think that everyone ideally should have an equal part of the contract. I know there's people who would probably disagree. There are GMs that like to kind of really keep the leash tight on the players, and I'm not the biggest fan of that personally. I think that, you're all sitting down for 4 or 5 hours a week to do collaborative storytelling, and that's what it is. And so everyone should be able to. Some people would consider a player coming up to a GM and asking, hey, I think this would be pretty cool for my character. What do you think? A breach of social contract theory. Because, the GM's supposed to be the one that writes the story, not the players. But I've always just seen it that everyone should have, the same amount of input, because that's just...
As close
you're
to
all
equal
sitting
as
down.
possible.
Yeah, the GM should reach out to the players too about things with their characters and vice versa.
But what if it's the game master who's the one not having fun?
I mean,
Did they have an obligation to continue the game that they're not having fun in, but all the players seem to be loving?
That's a question. Is it an even split as far as the say, or should it be proportional to how much personal effort each player puts into the game? The DM is putting 10 times more effort than any individual player, so they got a lot more skin in the game as far as that goes.
Imagine you have a player who's on their phone the whole time. They're only there because they are really excited about shooting their bow. And it's a mixed game where combat happens like a quarter to a third of the time. Yeah, I want to cut parts out. But no, imagine that's...
No, I know you're not talking about me.
And that one player, because that's all they care about, is just they really want to shoot their bow. So they don't engage, they don't talk to the players, they don't do anything else, they don't loot, they don't engage with NPCs, they do nothing but sit on their phone. And then when combat rolls around, they kind of look up, wait for their turn, shoot the arrow, and then they're not having a good time. And they're putting no effort into this game.
Yeah,
they don't matter. They are a useless human being. They should not have as much weight as the DM.
Tell us.
All right, we've got 100% agreement on this. Let's go to the next topic.
All right. No, I totally agree with you, because I actually have players like that in my current game. The way I usually do D&D is... Well, it's hard. Actually, I made a mistake, and I can go into that, but it's with my friends. The way I do D&D usually is I run it with people who've never played. I like being the kind of that gateway to RPGs for them, so they can open up to it. And they all, 3 of my 5 new players... I had 2 veterans and 3 new, and they all love D&D now. They enjoy the game, and they actively engaged it. But that's, at first, they didn't know what to do, and that's totally understandable. They're on their phone because they're like, what can I do? And I had to open up, hey, talk to NPCs, do some certain roles. Or I called them out and say, hey, one of my friends, let's call him Xavier. I was like, hey, Xavier, why don't you do this? And then he'd be like, oh, that's a great idea. And, I had to call him out at first. And that was kind of the contract we wrote ourselves. I think they may have accepted that as our social contract now that I'm saying this out loud, and it's kind of blowing my mind. Then maybe they're waiting for me to call on them to do something, because for a while, they just didn't know what to do, and I would always say, this is what you should do. And I'm trying to open up the idea of it's your own choice. And they've started to reach past that a bit, but my friend is still very in his own shell when he plays this game. He's playing a very meaty, just beefcake. He's playing a samurai in 3.5, semi-homebrewed, so he's stupidly powerful in combat. Out of it, really has no skills. But I made him one of the way I try to counteract as a DM, knowing he'd be kind of new to it, is I made him one of the big parts of the plot, so he'd have to pull in, but even then it can be hard. So what I found, split-wise with the players, some players will pick up the slack, and I know he cares. Sometimes players just don't know what to do, so skill level could also go to the fact of, kind of that social contract of, what they don't know what to do.
They're used to pushing A and getting a menu.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that's pretty much what he was
to
like.
answer Clayton, and to tie in a point that I made earlier, I guess I'm sort of hobbying in the way I look at social contract, in that I feel like if we do it proportionally like KP said, where the more effort you put in, the more say you have, there's such a potential for abuse that, then you have, and I've been in this situation where I put a lot of time into a game and I was close with the person running it, and so the two of us are sort of just always talking about it, and I'd always be like, what do you think about this? And they'd be like, yeah, and none of the other players, even if they were invested, but maybe not as invested as I were, had anywhere near the amount of say that I did. And I was essentially backseat GMing. I felt like that was definitely a breach of social contract theory, because, yeah, it sucks if people aren't having fun. But if you go off this proportional system, there's such a potential for you getting that megalomaniac game master, something like that. I mean, that's just the way I guess I look at social contract theories. I feel like we need those rules in place to stop that from happening.
And so the asshole on their phone has equal say as someone who literally, like, lives and breathes for this game.
I mean, it sucks, but I think so, yeah.
And it's part of the GM to pull them in, too. Because every time I see my friends on my phone, I'll call them out and say, hey, Xavier, what are you doing?
I'm not saying that they should be on their phone. I'm not saying that. But I'm also not saying that just because someone lives and breathes the game means that they should have special treatment.
Also, I feel like you could get into trouble with that because people... I mean, you don't really know somebody else's life when you're not in it, and so you might get people in, like, arguments about who actually is putting more time into the game.
Just because you're not talking about the game doesn't mean you're not thinking about it.
You're not thinking about it constantly,
exactly.
and yeah.
I can speak from personal experience, and I'm sure Clayton has my back 100% on this. When you find yourself in situations like that as a DM, you quickly realize that you're getting a raw deal, and not long thereafter, burnout sets in, and then you lose the DM. So, I don't know. I mean, this is kind of John Locke here. This is, I'm going out there and using my liberty and putting my labor into a thing, and then I get my fair return from that. And, that's the fair distribution of goods and so forth. I tend to lean on that one, man. Somebody who shows up and doesn't think about the game until they sit down at the table, and then maybe only 10% of the time they're actually engaged. They're just not putting as much into the experience that everyone else is having as the guy who's got the binder full of NPCs and maps and, yada, yada, yada. Like,
I guess I'm also operating under the assumption that in this hypothetical scenario, this person is never going to use their share of the social contract theory. Mm-hmm. If they're as uninvested and uninterested as in this scenario we're assuming they are, you really don't have to worry about them like speaking up about something even though they don't really have a place to do so.
Well, what if Bowie McPhonerson steps up and says, scroll. So guys, scroll. I'm really bored. Like, can we do some more combat? Like, I can shoot 3 arrows at once now.
We're the dragons.
I mean, everyone else in this scenario, again, that we've been really fleshing out, has the same say as him. So they could easily shut him down in this scenario.
They could, but there's always a dominant personality at the table.
I'm assuming it's not phony McPhonerson.
But I've been in the situation where the dominant personality at the table is running the game in a direction that the people who don't really project themselves, they hate the direction that the game is in, but they don't have the confidence to, one, oppose the more forceful player, or to tell the game master, like, just afraid of hurting the game master's feelings because the game master is their significant other.
Guess that's a fair point too. But unfortunately, again, we're now delving into tropes that every gaming group has. Like, there's always going to be that dominant personality, and that's something you can either plan for or attempt to adapt to. I was talking to someone last night that was like, yeah, in RPGs, plans only never survive first contact usually, so you kind of just have to adapt to that person, I guess.
First contact. Adapt, like the Borg.
Assimilate.
Yeah, assimilate.
Yeah.
Star Wars.
We're kind of just spitballing hypotheticals here, but I wanted to ask everybody as part of this topic and to maybe get some concrete examples when this actually happened. Have you guys run a game with or played as characters in, or even had an idea for a character concept that you couldn't implement, you had to change later on, something like that, because you quickly found that you were, butting up against the walls of the social contract? Like, it's kind of part of the false advertisement, I feel, that's implicit in role-playing games, that you can do anything you want. Well, this is one of those places where that's not true. So, what kinds of characters have you not been able to play or play fully because of this kind of thing?
Well, I have an example because that's what I've been talking a lot about, like, my friend Xavier and stuff from the GM perspective. I'm currently running a game, just, D&D, and I kept it very open source, where I told the new players, do whatever you want. If you make a broken character, I'll adapt the game. Like, you can use any book. that was my mistake. But it was like, use what you want. I'll approve it, of course, but just have fun. My goal in D&D is no matter how broken you feel, no matter how silly things become, as long as all of my players are enjoying themselves, that's great. And in the beginning, that principle worked very well, but now I have a few more of the veteran players are kind of like, one in particular is complaining a little more because they're much more like, strict, like they know what they're doing, they've made a very good build, and they're working a rogue. So they're actually playing the variant of the rogue where they're not the ones doing the going off, ruining the party stuff. It's one of the new players who, the social contract we came in and accepted was we're going to play 3-5, we're going to have fun, I built you a world, do what you want, and play your characters, we established who we were and how they all know each other, and the whole idea was just be your character, but he very much, his character is him. He never, it's one of the first D&D experience you pretty much just play yourself in a lot of cases, and that's fine. But he's a very dominant personality, someone who very much likes to lead and control. He's the face. And more or less is just, anything he does, he just does that in a whim without even thinking. And we have in and out of character, like we say, is this in or out of game? But always in game for him, even if it sounds silly. And that's diverted a lot of the story, because as a DM, I still have to tell the story that he's trying to paint. I'm like, okay, you do that thing. That happens. And all the players are like, what the hell? And I'm like, you guys didn't stop them, and this is what's happening. And I'm trying to adapt, clearly people are upset about it. I've been pulled aside, and they're like, what do we do about it? I'm like, this is the player's choice. I'm trying to be an impartial DM. I'm just giving you the story. And I've done some things, I've limited his power a bit, but then I'm starting to fringe on him, and it looks like one of the past few sessions, a big thing went down, and he's not having as much fun. So I'm at that delicate situation where he's elevated himself, where if I do too much, he's not having fun. And every time I try to stop a little bit to make everyone else have fun, then it's turned to a hodgepodge. So I'm in a weird rut right now, and I think we're gonna get out of it. It's just really up to the players at this point, because I'm trying not to impress on anybody. It's hard. Sorry, it's a big example. Again, overall the game is great, it's just a few scenarios.
Oh no, I think it's, the way you talk about it's terrible.
I know that's not
I know. I think your girlfriend plays in that game, right?
Yeah, she's the. I was gonna say
she's the problem one, right?
It's terrible. No, she's the veteran player who's been complaining about it because this character kind of because he's naturally kind of he likes to joke with people, but it's very hard hitting jokes. Let's just say not tough love, just kind of tough. And he does a lot to her because he sees that she gets reactions, and it's supposed to be in game, but it's starting to bleed out of game because he's just kind of being a weenie. And I haven't talked to him yet because I'm trying to be the polite DM. I'm using polite words, but it's hard because now my girlfriend, other people are like, this isn't fun. He's ruining a lot, and I'm like, okay. So like I said, it's when one player actively is attacking the story and everyone else is just trying to go with it. It's a weird balance.
A corollary of that would be in a game where because of loot, because of build, one character is just head and shoulders more powerful than all the other characters, sometimes even combined. It's, as a game master, it is incredibly difficult to find the balance to kind of rein what that character can do without being so heavy-handed with it that player knows, this is getting thrown at me so that I'm not the most powerful, that I'm not the center of attention, that I'm not. And whenever you end up doing that, you throw something at the other players and they're just going to get mopped. Every time I've seen this happen, seems like it's happened where the character that is most powerful continues to be the most powerful until something is done in system to nerf that character, because once they get ahead, there's really no way of using the rules to kind of rein that in. As long as everybody seems to be having fun, I don't want to tell somebody, hey, can you kind of pull back a little bit? I don't know. That's something that I've encountered before. It's something that I've struggled with. I've not come up with a good solution for.
And it can be different depending on the other players too, because there's kind of two types of people. There's people that played Final Fantasy VII and hated when Sephiroth was in their party, and people that loved when Sephiroth was in their party. And I was one of the people that always enjoyed Sephiroth because you could just watch him kill the shit out of everything. And so it's I'm always I don't care. As long as I get to do something, which I definitely do in this current game. You're definitely way more powerful than everybody else.
We should have an entire episode that is an Abena post-mortem when we're done.
Definitely.
I think that would be useful.
Fire Emblem has a similar thing to where you always start off with a unit that's significantly more powerful than your other units at the start, but sort of start to fall off as time goes on because they don't have any room to grow. And I think that's kind of what can be done with those sort of characters, is ideally the rest of the characters will either catch up or surpass them if the GM, maybe the GM has kind of played the long con, where they're just all right, I'm going to limit you, but I'm not going to do it openly. It's going to be like a slow, gradual thing until eventually, you know, everyone's either on the same playing field or the other players move past them.
That takes a lot of patience on those other players' parts, though.
Yeah. Jordan, could you rephrase your initial point of what you wanted us to sort of...
Yeah, I was wondering if there have been instances where people were either running a game, or usually it's more particularly, were playing a character or had an idea for a character that maybe even before you made the character, but maybe afterwards, you realized that you weren't going to be able to play the character that you wanted to play in the way that you wanted to play it because of the constraints of social contract, because of the expectations of others, and so on.
I definitely have an example there. I joined in a long-running game series of the group of friends. And my first character in this series was a very, like, not even necessarily, somewhat naive, but, like, very optimistic character that sort of just rolled with the punches and wanted to make friends with a lot of people, but had that, like, small village boy mentality sort of deal. And as soon as I made this character and sort of started to see them in the world, I immediately realized the social contract theory for this group was such that this character just could not work. Like, there was some grimdark elements, and, like, NPCs and other PCs would sort of go out of their way to, like, just make my character feel like shit for sort of being the way they were. And that's fine in character, but not a character you start to realize, like, well, I have a way of trying to play this character. And I can't really do that if, you know, there's all of these sort of conditions, and this world is apparently has this inherent darkness to it where everyone's just very mean. Mm-hmm. It's, for lack of a better word, I know that sounds juvenile. And so, you know, there was some other issues I sort of vaguely talked about in other episodes too, with the party and the way that, like, I think I brought up in the romance thing where my character got in a relationship with someone else, and that broke the party dynamic completely because we were the only two characters that, like, role-played and talked to each other. That's definitely one thing where the social contract theory of this group was, this is a world where you kind of gotta be a little tough to survive, or at least know how to talk to people to get them to like you enough to survive. And having not known that at all, I came in and found, like, wow, this character kind of just muddled along because he couldn't really do anything, and he was a charisma character, but no one wanted to talk to him. You know, I had like a plus in this system. It was really decent. A plus 14 in charisma was very high. But anytime I'd open my mouth, people would just shut me down because they didn't like what I was saying, or some other weird, grimdark thing. And so that is definitely, in my case, an exact example of how you cannot play a character because the social contract theory just brushes up against it.
I had a character, this has been many years ago, in an Old World of Darkness vampire game where I created a Malkavian character to play. For anyone who's not familiar, Malkavians are, as part of their clan, like their bloodline is mental illness. And I designed this guy to be fucking terrifying. I was going to be in and out of character. My goal was to make the other people sitting around the table afraid of me. 5 minutes into this this chronicle, I had to give up the character because of the social contract. Not because of all the stuff I wanted to do, but because nobody else took the Malkavians as this scary thing. The mental illness of the Malkavians was a joke. It was an established joke in their schema of World of Darkness Malkavians, and there was no way I was going to break through with that. I was going to be the comic relief in their eyes. 5 minutes in, I was letting them know I had to change my character.
Mental illness is so funny. Look at the weirdo. Man,
Yep.
Vampires are great. I've always wanted to do something similar to that, Clayton, where I play a character that is genuinely terrifying. I think it'd be a lot of fun. I think it'd be really interesting. It'd be challenging to act it out. But so far, I've not seen a game in my...
I would say...
This group and other groups aside, I've not seen a game where I had the ability to do that.
I would actually say our social contract theory with this group wouldn't let you do that.
With the greater group, no. I think we could cultivate a smaller group.
Yeah, but the bigger group, there's definitely could not.
And then stage a coup!
On the trend of Old World of Darkness vampires, I'm currently in a game where I myself am breaching the social contract, and I and the GM are trying to figure out how to make it work. I have a really, really OP character. Like, she's statted the fuck up. I've been playing her for almost 1.5 years now. And I've been trying to work on ways where I don't just derail an entire story session. Because last session, I've been playing with these people for like 1.5 years, and my character has telepathy powers, which means they can use voice stuff, and they don't wear earphones. So I accidentally put the entire group to sleep, and they couldn't wake up for 3 hours. Like, I'll just do whatever the fuck I want. And I did, and it was great. But I have to, me and the GM are trying to figure out what the social contract of that is, because I worry that I overpower sessions, and I don't want that to happen, because the other characters are really cool and really fun, and we get to do a lot of fun stuff. But how do you go about it when you know, like, I feel like a lot of times social contract issues are a problem because people don't know that they're problems. Is there a way to talk about things where, like, you know that there is this problem, but you don't know, like, how to further it off? Because I feel like it's out of my hands.
If you are the character who is overpowered and you are recognizing it, the power to change that is more than the storyteller or the game master. It is incumbent upon you to involve the other players in the game to find some way. Sometimes it's just a simple matter of sitting back and letting them have the spotlight.
Well, I mean, I always do, like, the other players, and specifically this character I'm playing, we're all very entangled, and the way that I've been trying to lessen her OP-ness is by having her, like, not lean on these other characters, but like, hey, listen, I need this help with this thing, and only you can do this. Can you help me? That kind of stuff. But it's a matter of, like, they literally don't wear headphones, and I could just literally put the entire party. I can.
Well, so don't.
But I needed to get the guy away, and I didn't know.
So
I'm just gonna give them headphones the next time I see them.
In character, talk to them, and then for this particular power, say in character, I have this power, you all know I have this power, here's how we're going to work around it. You have done your share of the social contract. It is up to them to make that mechanical change to not only accommodate you in your character's ability, but now it is in their wheelhouse to feed off of that, to make it more powerful, because they have actions that they can do to boost everyone in that situation. What is good for one is good for the many in that particular case.
It's a fun character and everybody likes it. It's just I've been noticing that I just overpower everything, and I'm having fun, but I don't want it to overshadow.
Yeah, and we've had something similar to that. Not like in the case that your situations where you're trying to like actually fix it because you realize like, oh, this is kind of getting out of hand. We had the opposite. An example where I was a player. We had somebody who, again, I won't say any names, but I played a game back when I was here at OU where they were literally cheating. Like they would roll, immediately grab the dice, like look up and go, insert this number, and it was always a hit. And this person actually admitted later, like, oh, we would have died all those times if I hadn't done it. And we're like, oh my gosh, it's like the point of D&D is sometimes you die, whatever, like it doesn't matter. But it was a really awkward thing because all of us knew it. The GM knew it. We talked to the GM, like he was obviously breaching our social contract of not cheating in D&D. Like that's just a good rule to have. And we talked to him like, what are we going to do? Because it's not fun. Like, if we die, we die, but we want a challenge, not just to win every time. And
Right.
Our GM looked at us, and he had to make the tough call we discussed like a few minutes earlier. And then when the GM sees us, how do they deal with this? And he went the tough love route, because like, if he wants to give me a tough time, I'm going to give him a tougher time. But the GM was good enough where he made really hard encounters, but specifically counters to his character that the rest of us could handle easily. And at that point, I was a high enough cleric where I could res ding mid-combat. So the thing is, if he died, which he died a lot after that, I found out, like there was insta-kills always like on him, and it was very targeted. He eventually picked up on it. And my GM went around to make a rule saying, always roll on the table in front of me so I could see it. Like, we had to adjust rules. And of course, his share being as big as ours, we all had to chip in on that. But as one of those social contract things, we're willing to do it just so we could have fun. Mm-hmm. It's one of those cases where we all work together without having to talk to the player, because if we talked to him, he just got, angry for being called out. It's one of those classic examples I never thought would happen to me, but
I had a very similar situation where a player was cheating in Dungeons and Dragons. The player was initially caught by a fellow player. The player came to me and let me know about it.
God bless you.
Knowing that it was happening, I caught the player, and at that moment, in the middle of the game, that player was ejected from the game. They never came back.
That's the way to do it, though. Like, honestly, like if they're cheating, you do something else if you want to win that badly.
The biggest part of our social contract is we're all here to have fun. Mm-hmm. We're all here to enjoy this game. And in my opinion, part of enjoying this game is everybody follows the same rules. granted, the game master has slightly different rules that they have to go by, but they still have rules they have to go by. But I don't tolerate players cheating at all.
That made me think, whenever I was researching this, I came across a lot of discussion about fairness, and there were a couple of points that I had pretty strong opinions about, and I'm curious to know, if other people feel the same way. One is that monsters and NPCs should follow the same rules that we do, that PCs do, unless there's a good narrative reason for them not to. I feel like if I'm playing a game and, magic works a certain way, but then all of a sudden the big bad is able to surpass that and TPK everybody, which runs into the next point, but, I feel like that gives me a very deep feeling of unfairness, and that might be an immaturity on my part, but I feel like it's important.
It's a very Deanna Troy way to say that. I have a very deep feeling of unfairness. I love it.
Well, what's a good narrative reason?
Oh, I should have known somebody would ask that.
For instance, I haven't played but maybe one session of 5th edition D&D, but a good buddy of mine is running a game, and from what it sounds like in that, you hardly ever get additional attacks as players, but monsters just get a pile of multiple attacks. And so it's kind of a completely different game from the player side and the GM side. And if you want to make monsters a little bit tougher, just give them 2 or 3 more attacks, and they can just, wail around on a bunch of different bad guys. And that's how you keep the old 3rd edition problem of one big bad taking one big attack every round, and then, 6 attacks coming at them every round, and, that whole problem. But, that's one of those examples. And also in D&D, spell-like abilities. Lots of monsters have spell-like abilities that they can just shoot and have no limit on them. But, what's a good reason to make it different?
I'm just coming with this off the top of my head, but I'm thinking if you had say a world where magic was based on one of those worlds where magic is based on ley lines, and generally a person can only, this is a really bad example, but a person can only draw from one of those at a time, and you've got a boss who's able to draw from 5 or 6 of them and make a much more powerful attack. I think it's okay to have that as long as the reason for it is kind of woven into the story, and as long as the players have received some sort of foreshadowing or warning signs that that's going to happen ahead of time. I don't think you should just be able to spring it on people.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, if you have it established in the contract itself, again, a game, the one I'm DMing, I did something very similar where recently a lot of my players have expressed that some people are getting OP, and beforehand I established certain things, I stick by the same rules for my enemies. They've actually quite easy fights for it because they're just such a powerful party. And one of the more veteran players, who this is where it happened to him, he's really good at adapting to the scenarios because he understands the GM, where him and I had this established. He told me a few times, I'm getting really powerful, dude, so if you want to nerf me at all, just let me know, kind of thing. And we had that well established, so I had a boss where one of his abilities didn't quite have the effect he wanted, and then as a good player in the contract we already had together, he goes, and he reacted that's weird, why didn't that happen? Because he knew I was nerfing him a bit, but he was able to adapt to that because we established it first. And it still worked, they still kicked its face in, but it was one of those moments where I had a cool moment where your ability didn't work, and then they just killed the dragon anyways. So, but yeah, again, you have to establish that first, because if you just spring it out, unless it's the first session and that's when you spring it, so it establishes it, it just doesn't work.
Minor spoiler for the first Matrix movie.
Oh, whoa.
This happens towards the beginning. If you haven't seen it, well, too bad.
I have established we do not do spoilers for movies that are more than 10 years old, so...
Well, The Matrix came out just last year.
What?
Yes, it's 1999.
My goodness. Oh, a new Star Wars is coming out.
I can't wait for that!
Oh, boy! Anyway, sorry.
Now this.
Let's try time travel. That's a good trick. So, in the Matrix movie, the first one, there is a very distinct moment where it is no longer a Keanu Reeves working at an office who is a hacker at home, and he goes to rave parties, and it's 1998, whatever year it would have been, right? 98. And all of a sudden, holy fucking shit, there's this crazy weird world of people that can jump across buildings. What? I think it'd be pretty neat if in an RPG you had a world established, players knew what was going on, they were playing in that world, and then much like The Matrix, there's a point where you throw something absolutely insane at them, and don't kill them with it, it's just a narratological element. that completely turns things on its head and makes the players realize, wow, there's this other thing going on, and then they can, of course, work up to being able to now, within the rules, act within that new thing. But I think that could be an interesting way to rip the rug out, introduce something crazy. Just be careful with that when you're doing that.
I think in fantasy settings, that's typically when you introduce like multi-dimensional play. You travel the planes and stuff, because then the sky's the limit for what kind of crazy shit you're gonna brush up against.
I think there's a big difference between there are different classes of abilities that the player characters are just never going to have remote access to, versus like a bait and switch where we discover that there's different rules, but we can still go by, we can still figure out the rules. Like spell-like abilities, Jordan, your point about those are, I consider those more along the lines of something that is actually kind of within the wheelhouse of the player characters to get access to. Because if the wizard had the same spellcasting level, they could devote all of their spell slots to those exact spells and have the exact same number of castings of those spells for the typical life of a monster, because in D&D, the typical life of a monster is like 5 or 6 rounds. Any wizard above a certain level is going to be able to memorize that many spells to have a comparable ability in that. So in that instance, a little bit of a fudging of the rules as to having monsters follow slightly different rules, I'm okay with that. I don't think it's fair for there to be an entire class of abilities where no player characters are ever going to have access to anything that is remotely similar to that. For example, I was in a game, it was a very heavily modified version of 3.5 D&D, where non-humanoid monsters had access to the abilities from 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons. So non-humanoid monsters could do a burst attack that threw everybody to the winds, like doing the push mechanic in 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons. Like they could do the pull mechanic, they could do the slide mechanics as part of attacks.
Wow.
And you're like, now here, we're just sitting over here on a lesser version of the rules.
Yes, exactly. And at the time,
4th edition is not as good as 3.5, but...
So they could do a Fusroda followed by a get over here.
Yes.
and so, I'm really curious, did the GM think that this was okay?
Yeah, this was the Game Master's homebrew rules, where we fought demons that had an ability that they could hit they could hit a PC, and as part of that hit, grapple them and pull, as part of their movement, pull the player character with them.
3 complex actions, essentially.
And then they still had their move.
Oh, it's a 4.
Yeah.
Wow. I see. That's,
Are these like kidnappers?
terrible.
Yeah, they were...
Sounds like they're just throwing kids into a van.
Essentially, I remember this combat because I felt like it was so fucking unfair, and it's been years now, and I'm still fuming about it because we had absolutely no access to essentially force movement besides doing a push maneuver.
Mm-hmm.
And that was our entire action. You couldn't combine that with an attack. In the rules, push is your attack action. You're not doing any damage with
Were
the
they
push.
trying to convey the feeling, apparently very successfully, that the monsters were better than you constantly, and that your back was always to the wall or something?
I think so. I picked up on this trend early in the campaign, and so I started keeping track. And to his credit, it was only non-humanoid monsters who had these extra abilities that were so foreign to what we had capability of doing. But even with high-powered magic that our characters had in our party, we could not duplicate any of these abilities. None of the spellcasters had any spells that would force movement on enemies or allies. It burns me. It still does.
Another strong opinion I've had really for a long time is that I personally really prefer to know the level of lethality in a game before I start playing. Like, I feel like, especially low lethality games, like D&D, especially, you know, where your bags of hit points slapping at each other.
Love that image.
You know, where generally going out and killing, like, you can expect to not really have yourself tested except for by boss level monsters. And I feel like low lethality games should never kill players in quote unquote stupid ways. Like, you shouldn't have a random encounter that wipes everybody out. I feel like things like that are okay in a game like Apocalyptia, where you're kind of expecting, you know, where the point is that the whole world is extremely dangerous. It's more realistic, so one bullet could take you out. But I feel like deaths should only happen in, like, story-centric ways, like ways that contribute to the story. And then I feel like there should always be warning signs for particularly lethal monsters and traps. I don't feel like it's fair for the GM to spring a trap on somebody that is liable to kill anybody who comes across it without giving some sort of way that it can be overcome or discovered. It's what other people think. Because I'm sure there's going to be disagreement on this.
So I just want to clarify that last point. So, like, having a trap that has the capability of taking a character at full health to dead. That's kind of what you mean by a trap like that.
Like a really lethal trap, yeah. Something that has some sort of like fire trap, for instance, in D&D that does so much damage that it can potentially take your fighter from full health to dead.
So, and not the point of like, well, this is the fourth trap in a row that the rogue is screwed up in disarming, so it goes off in his face, and he'd already gotten down to 10 hit points, and now this trap hits him for 11.
Right, exactly. I think you still can have... I think it's still better. Like, I feel better about low lethality games if stupid deaths like that don't happen. They just feel better to me for some reason.
I've always thought that, personally at least, that character deaths should usually have some sort of story impact or character arc impact, usually. I'm not the biggest fan of... You know, if you die in combat, like, that's one thing. It's not great, but hopefully there's some other avenues that opens up for the party, or something else that your death isn't just, well, you rolled bad and he rolled good. Shrugs.
Yeah.
There's also an element of a scenario in which you kind of like the trap thing, where it's just like, there's this one real lethal trap in there, and if you guys don't find it, it's gonna kill you. But maybe, again, that's just the way that I look at RPGs, where I feel that, like, character death should mean something rather than just, again, being, you had 10 health and I hit you for 12 damage. Roll a new character.
Yeah, and that it really depends on the system too, obviously. And again, it's the contract you make beforehand. Because my friend's game that I mentioned before, with that the weenie who's rolling cheating.
The weenie.
He said early on, like, the way I play D&D, it's your guys' story. You help me write it. Like, we're gonna work together, like you said, like a working narrative. But he has a very highly lethality respect. If we mess up on a trap or an enemy kills us, you just have to expect it's D&D. He ran one of the fantasy universes where it's very easy to get res, so just expect to die a lot. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those things where dying really didn't have an impact because you just pay for it and you come back. Mm-hmm. So we had a trap. Our rogue, the first thing she did, she walked up to, we didn't know it was called like a banshee scream, like she had no idea, walks up, fails, dies. That was her first thing she did when she came in. And we all looked at her. I had a thing to stop, like I had a death stopping spell, didn't know yet, and I was like, we have those traps now? And my DM was like, whoops. Yeah, those exist. And we were like, oh, okay. So sometimes in Catch You Off Guard, it's a bit annoying, but in that world, we rezzed her and went back in. Like, went to town, it was fine.
In that game, is there a fear of death? Where
No.
So you're invincible?
I came back, I died 4 times, I was the running record, my friend had 5, actually beat me out. He had a celestial waiting room if you died. So when we died, we just sat there and waited to get res. Like, he made sure, like, death had no real consequence, which is kind of almost a bad thing in itself, because really, if you died, I mean, we could still be party wiped. That was the biggest threat. If we all died, who's going to pay for you to come back? So that's what it came down to, but you're right. We felt invincible in a lot of respects, so.
Was there a sense that if most of you died and you had to take the time to res your friends, would the bad guy get away? Would you fail your mission? So was there failure?
That's a good question, because the thing is, like, in that game, we did have a failure part, but it was a story element, and he made us fail on purpose. So the only time we ever had a real threat, it was forced, so...
Interesting.
Yeah, it was a fun game, just because it was really just a fun story to romp around in, but you're right, we really had no threats. A few times we almost got party wiped, and that was the only time. Like, and the only reason, like, our GM felt nice, because we did get party wiped once, but one of our characters, the guy who cheated, was able to kill this mind flayer through probably cheating, now I think about it. So, because we got party wiped big, and then he killed it through a really dumb way. I won't go into detail, but yeah, you're right. Now I think about it, it's a weird kind of contract we had there where we never really had to worry about consequences. So it was a very strange but fun game.
It is, in my opinion, that there should always be the fear of death, but deaths should be earned through story. And I think that random encounters of death, they should be there, but they should never, like, fully be activated, in the sense of, like, you don't want to lose someone because of a random encounter. I think that that's not fair to the character or to the player. But it should always be like, yeah, there's some really bad shit out there, and see it happen to other, like, NPCs. They know that it's there. They know that they could die if they aren't careful. But at the same time, I don't know, if I was the DM, I'd fudge it, because I want there to be an impactful reason that person's no longer in the party.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to assume, even in, like, real squishy games like D&D, where you can get by with a lot, I tend to play it like everything is super lethal. Mm-hmm. Because why in the hell would somebody put a trap in that's not going to kill somebody? You're either trying to kill someone or capture them. That's what you're doing with the trap. Mm-hmm. And either way, it's terrible. The idea that, some powerful wizard would make a spell that does a d6 damage is ridiculous. Why would you waste your time?
It's my trap will just give you a paper cut.
Yeah, it's a fucking mouse trap. And I think that, I don't know, I play overly cautious, but I really like really lethal games because I think it tends to keep players thinking and cuts down on the amount of gonzo bullshit that people try to pull. Mm-hmm. So I like that. I think it keeps the game more serious, and when people do ridiculous things that they shouldn't be able to get away with, it kind of breaks my suspension of disbelief. So that's my own take on that.
I think that's something I've discovered, is that a few of us here in this circle have different levels of acceptance of gonzo bullshit. I tried to run a one-shot the other day, and I went in there thinking, like, hey, players, how gonzo do you want this to be? Pretty gonzo? Okay, I'll do my best. Can I jump off of a 5-story building onto a ship and a motorcycle? Fuck no, that's stupid.
I really wanted to do it.
I can't. I can't allow someone to do something like that, because it totally... when I DM, I think of a set of rules that make sense in the world. Whatever those rules may be, it could be very fantastical, but then you don't break them without a good reason to do so. And I can't DM a gonzo thing, because it just becomes this blob of incoherent stunts. By the same token, I don't think I could play a game where death has to be earned by both player and DM deciding, you know what, it's a good time to die. Because I like to have my players just fear death. I like to have them just feel like it could be around the corner at any point in time.
Isn't that what we did with Abena, though?
No, Alkir could die at any moment. I assume you're not fudging shit, Clayton.
I haven't fudged anything for a game.
No, I mean,
just play really fucking
Magnus.
smart. I'm a great player. I'm really good at the game.
Social contract of player.
that was a rule. That wasn't an implicit rule. That was an explicit rule that I presented to everybody at the very beginning of the rule book. That was a rule I presented to everyone at the very beginning of the campaign. I mean, he just happened to be the only one who remembered it.
I have no problem with the player choosing death, by the way. Like, especially if it's cool, if it makes sense. I have zero problem with that. But I couldn't run a game where death is impossible unless GM and players sit down and decide, what do you think? Is it your time to go?
Yeah, I don't think that's... I mean, that's kind of opinion to the extreme, in that, like, I have no issues with someone dying in, like, a final boss fight, or even a boss fight in proper. You should still have that fear of death. But fighting a couple goblins level 1 and just... they get a couple lucky hits in and you're dead, and this character that you just put a bunch of time and fucking effort in is now dead because of some bullshit rules. Like,
right.
Yeah, level 1
that sounds kind of stupid to me.
I agree with you, yeah. I was going to say, because I definitely go think every singer on the table. Like, thinking about my friend's game was fun. There's a lot of issues with it, but especially the death thing, like being the healer, especially since I could res, you need the fear of death because, A, it gives that, like, fulfillment afterwards. Like, we could have died and we won. Like, it gives you that rush, like, we actually, like, fought death and won. Like, we could have literally fought the aspect of death.
Like, that was a close fight.
Yeah, it was a close fight, and we did it. And it's like one of those, it makes a good narrative effort saying, like, you almost died. Because I've had a moment where I got a nat 1 in the last build. My friend's dad made it more narrative because he didn't kill me, but he got a crit and, like, stabbed me in the chest, like, said something, like, dramatic. I dropped to the ground with 1 health, but my friend actually crit and knocked him off. So it was a super cool role-playing element, but I could have died. He was going to coup de grace me if my friend didn't show up. It was 1 turn before I died. So it can make amazing moments like that. Like, this dude fell off a tower. Actually, did die, now I think about it. We knocked him off a tower, and I had to go stab him. But still, like, it made that really cool moment where, like, I could have died, and I looked, and I'm like, this could be it for my character. And my friend came up, like, but wait. And then the thing is, you should have the fear of death too, because it adds a level of realism to the world, like something we can connect to from here. Like the fantastic is cool, where you can come back and still love that character, but the idea that death is permanent means you're going to think about what you do instead of just doing something Gonzo, like, oh, backflip and kick a dragon in the head, and there's like, alright, it eats you. Sorry, you're dead. So it adds that level of let me think before I act.
I guess what I'm getting at is unlucky dice rolls in a non-crucial moment killing your character, or that example with the trap, are for me just unfortunate things, because then it's like, that's going to breed resentment. I mean, unless you all, again, your social contract theory is you come in and you're like, hey, this is a hyper-lethal game. Like, we talk about Apocalyptia a lot on the podcast. I go into that game with a modification of our social contract, knowing that, like, I could get random ones, like, headshotted at some point, and I'm totally fine with that. But, like, in other games where maybe that is not as prevalent or not as defined, it's hard for me to really be like, well, here you are dying to these wolves because you can't roll right, or I'm rolling really well, or something like that, you know?
Most modern games, to my knowledge, have some kind of bennies or luck points or force points or some kind of resource that players can use to tone down that you're talking about. So I think a decent game is going to give more options than just, well, the dice say so I'm fucked. I hate games that don't give you something like that. They're miserable.
And so, are there any of you that don't like to know how lethal a game is before you start it? Just out of
It
curiosity.
might be fun once
Yeah.
to go in there knowing nothing, and then just, I mean, you're gonna die. Like, it's like playing Dark Souls, you know? You start Dark Souls and you're like, this is gonna be a fun romp through a fantastical
40 hours later.
Yeah.
You almost feel like you have to know, at least for me, because when you want to make a character, you want to know, like, okay, should I not put gonzo amounts into how this character's personality works and acts, because they might just die at any moment? Because then, like, you're gonna get real fucking tired. Where they're like, okay, they're dead. Well, next one doesn't get as much effort. Oh, that one's dead. All right.
Good thing I gen 3 characters.
Yeah, and then you're like, well, this one is just a base template. Like, I have just made a character sheet, and maybe they hit things. Maybe this one will die. Who knows? I don't know. So I feel like you need to know the level of
This
fidelity
little
going in.
piggy went to market.
Yeah. That's something you should establish first. That's what I told my players, like, it's not going to be a highly lethal game. I've had one player die in the past year. So I told them, like, you're going to have a challenge, but I'm not trying to kill you as a DM. I'm trying to give you a fun time that feels like you're earning something.
I think lethal games lend themselves even more towards character development and, a detailed setting and character personality and things like that, because there's consequences for things, and if the DM is playing right, then it works the same for all the NPCs, and so you're much less likely to just be thrown into a battle with dozens of bad guys who are going to fight to the last man and whatever. That's ridiculous, and that's not really how fights happen. People don't want to die, and you would have a lot more situations where someone gets clearly beaten and then surrenders, or you'd have a lot more politics going on. Like, you think about things like settings like Game of Thrones or Dune or something like that. Like, when violence happens, it's massive. It's a huge deal, and somebody gets their asses killed off. The rest of the time, it's talking so that we're not murdering the shit out of each other. So, I don't know. I think that if you've got a Final Fantasy kind of thing, you're going to have some anime scenario where people are jumping from building top to building top and shooting fireballs and whatever, and then maybe eventually they'll talk about it at some point. But
If we're lucky.
yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah, just like I got to the point with D&D where every single time I played it, even on the online like DDO, I played an orc whose parents were murdered by humans. Mm-hmm. That was my entire backstory.
Well, guys, what do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Woo!
If you say so.
Yay.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons Attribution No Derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.